Hello and welcome to Freedom Talk. This show I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about an editorial coming up in the next issue of Freedom Talk. I'm going to talk about optimism versus pessimism. We live in pretty dark times when we have seen our government get out of control. We've seen tyranny. We've seen a whole world locked down, people dying either from disease, which could be biowarfare, or even from the so-called cures and vaccines themselves. So in this environment, and now we're facing runaway inflation, gas prices that are just unbelievable, and the possible destruction of our republic. So we all are asking ourselves, is there a reason to hope? Can we be optimistic about the future, or are we facing a future devoid of hope? Let's discuss this on today's Freedom Talk. I've got a bunch of things to bring to you today. A clip from an upcoming show with Joshua Phillipp, the host of Crossroads on Epic TV, and I'm going to give you a little glimpse of that. I'm going to start by talking about this man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and this particular book is by Eric Metaxas, and it is a biography of Bonhoeffer. I'm going to read the back cover to you. As Adolf Hitler and the Nazis seduced a nation, bullied a continent, and attempted to exterminate the Jews of Europe, a small number of dissidents and saboteurs worked to dismantle the Third Reich from the inside. One of these was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a pastor and author. In his New York Times best-selling biography, Eric Metaxas takes both stands of Bonhoeffer's life, the theologian and the spy, and draws them together to tell a searing story of incredible moral courage in the face of monstrous evil. Metaxas presents the fullest accounting of Bonhoeffer's heart-wrenching decision to leave the safe haven of America to return to Hitler's Germany, and sheds new light on Bonhoeffer's involvement in the famous Valkyrie plot and in Operation 7, the effort to smuggle Jews into Switzerland. Bonhoeffer is the story of a life framed by a passion for truth and a commitment to justice on behalf of those who face implacable evil. So check out this book by Eric Metaxas. I believe you can get it on Amazon. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was indeed a man of character who stood up to the evil of his time. Let's make no mistake, we are facing evil now. What we are seeing is a battle between good and evil. It's no longer just politics. It's no longer just opinions. We have little girls being pushed to get hysterectomies, for children to have sex changes and hormone inhibitors that will change their lives forever. We have bad actors who are trying to bring down this nation, destroy the economy, and lead us into a socialist hellhole. So in this environment, can we have optimism? Or do we need to be pessimistic? Is there hope for the future? I'm going to play a clip of Joshua Phillipp from the Epic Times in an interview that we had recently, which I'm going to air next Tuesday, August 23rd at 4 o'clock p.m. Arizona time, 5 Mountain Standard Time, and 7 Eastern Time. So let's take a look. How much optimism do you have that we could save this republic? Or pessimism?
Yeah, I'm personally pretty optimistic, although I do think there's going to need to be reforms in the government, because what we've seen is that some of the systems that be are not working. Some of the systems that be are being significantly abused. That there's significant bloating within government, and it's become something that the founding fathers never intended for it to become. That the basic freedoms of Americans are being trampled upon, and that pretty much the American character itself is being kind of demonized and attacked. The idea of the dissident, as you mentioned, that's the lifeblood of the American right there. G.K. Chesterton talked about America as a nation of kings, where people, each individual is imbued with the abilities of self-sovereignty to an extent.
Yeah.
And you're expected to be able to make good choices and poor choices as long as you don't harm the life or property of others in making those choices. Really, the American character is one of, I think, fierce independence.
So stay tuned for this great interview with Joshua Phillipp. Joshua Phillipp, like me, has a good understanding of history and the battles that we face today. He is a superb journalist, lead investigator, senior investigator for the Epoch Times. Now, the reason why the FBI's plans are falling apart is because people have stood up to them. People have had the courage to stand up, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer did. In the face of threats, in the face of danger, he stood up. And in today's world, we have to stand up. We have to show that courage. And I really think the people who are willing to do that are a source of optimism. Those who sit back knowing what's happening and do nothing or are self protective aren't helping. So I want to encourage all my listeners to push your boundaries, to make a stand. And you're going to hear Joshua Phillipp next Tuesday talk about the incredible, immense effect that this has in a positive way. And he discusses the future of our republic. I want to read you a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's a famous quote, and it speaks a lot to what I want to cover in the rest of the show. The essence of optimism is not its view of the present, but the fact that it is the inspiration of life and hope when others give in. It enables a man to hold his head high when everything else seems to be going wrong. It gives him strength to sustain the reverses and yet to claim the future for himself instead of abandoning it to his opponent. It is true that there is a silly, cowardly kind of optimism, which we must condemn. But the optimism that is well for the future should never be despised, even if it is proven wrong 100 times. It is health and vitality, and the sick man has no business to impugn it. There are people who regard it as frivolous, and some Christians think it is impious for anyone to hope and prepare for a better earthly future. They think that the meaning of the present events is chaos, disorder, and catastrophe, and in resignation or pious escapism, they surrender all responsibility for reconstruction and for future generations. It may be that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow, and in that case, though not before, we shall gladly stop working for a better future. This is an amazing quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that is so relevant to today's world. And we see several responses to this time of crisis. One, probably the most common one, is to bury one's head in the sand, to keep your head low, to try to avoid any kind of persecution. This has been very common. This was the general response when the Jews were herded into the Warsaw Ghetto. And there were people who saw the danger and wanted to get together and resist. And yet, this first group of people actually resisted the resistors and wanted to be self protective. But as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, if they had known from the beginning what was intended for them, they would have realized they couldn't have made it any worse. And I think there's a good lesson there. We have to stand up and fight in the early days before it's too late, because the freedom fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto finally, when the general population realized they were facing extermination and genocide, finally began to fight. And they put up a really great fight, but by then it was too late. There's a second type of people, and this is, I think, pretty common in Christianity, of people basically saying, well, it's all in God's hands. I can't do anything. We're not of this world. Christ's kingdom is not of this world, so on and so forth. But I have to say, what if Queen Esther had taken that view? What if the Maccabees, of course, this is intertestamental, but the Maccabees were a group of Jews who resisted the Syrian incursions into Jerusalem and the atrocities that they perpetrated. And there's that story is still talked about today. They're still seen as heroes. When you're talking about direct harm to our children, to our families, to our society, the Christian absolutely has a responsibility to stand up, nonviolently if possible. But I think there are instances where violence is warranted. Think about the rise of Adolf Hitler and if we had done nothing in a time when ours was a largely Christian nation. There are a couple of other responses that are in addition to Christian, although Christianity and Christians can embrace these whether knowingly or not. One is Stoicism, which is the idea that you're going to be tough and emotionless in the face of suffering. Stoicism accepts the suffering of life through an indifference to both pain and joy, while focusing on a certain mental toughness and code of personal virtue. Stoicism takes the world as it is rather than allowing oneself to be controlled by fear of pain or longing for pleasure. Buddhism posits that suffering is caused by our desires, and so the path to inner peace lies in a state of nirvana, where self and desire are extinguished. In that sense, both Stoicism and Buddhism are neither optimistic nor pessimistic. There is some value to be derived from each of these ideologies, but they're deficient. They do not present a hope and an optimism for the future. And that's something somewhat unique to Christianity, the idea that we are in this world to better it and to redeem this creation, not to escape it or just bear up under it in hopelessness. But Christians can wander into the temptation to give up on the present world as a lost cause and retreat into a personal escapism, which helps no one and does nothing to better our present world. So we have to avoid this trap, those of us who are Christians, of standing by and doing nothing. And I had read, I think it was in Josephus, that some of the Christians were persecuted after the fires set by Nero in Rome because they didn't help put the fires out. They determined that this was God's will and they shouldn't get involved. And as you can imagine, this didn't make them very popular with their neighbors. It is important to get involved, and we don't have politics as usual now. We have policies and ideologies that are directly impacting the well-being, the health, and the lives of our children and ourselves. In the midst of a dark and oppressive society, Bonhoeffer still believed, as the psalmist wrote, "I would have despaired unless I believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." That's something that Bonhoeffer believed in deeply, that he could do some good in this world. He chose optimism as a responsibility, not just in the afterlife, but in the present world. And indeed, Bonhoeffer made a huge difference. In the end, he did end up being executed by the Nazi regime. But think about all the writings that he did that have inspired millions. Think about the people that he helped and saved in his time. His was a devotion to doing all he could to bring love, compassion, truth, and beauty into the present reality, and not surrender to being a light in the darkness. His was a life of devotion to doing all the things he could to bring love, compassion, truth, and beauty into the present reality, and not surrender being a light in the darkness, working for a better future until the day of judgment. Strong people do not seek self-protective escape. We shine brightest in the darkest times, advancing hope even while holding a realistic view of life's challenges and circumstances and facing them head on. We can and must be bulwarks against chaos and despotism, bearing suffering and scorn for the sake of those in need of strength and encouragement. You can order this wonderful coffee that we roast ourselves. We'll also send you our editorial each month, along with a link to Freedom Talk magazine. We also have cups and hats and shirts and that type of thing at linktapgo.com/Kelly. So I just want to encourage you, there is reason for optimism, both this world and if you believe in Judeo-Christian values in the next world as well. So keep your head up, keep your feet moving forward. But I also believe that it isn't too late to save our republic, that each of us can make a crucial difference. So get involved in your communities, run for your school boards, run for local office, help and serve others if you're not the political kind. And frankly, I don't know if I'll ever run for office, but you can still have an impact. Dinesh D'Souza talked about the first founders of this country and what he called the Republic of Letters. These were people like Benjamin Franklin, who never ran for office, but nonetheless had a significant impact on society. So thank you for watching Freedom Talk. Have a great day. Keep your spirits up. You can be realistic and optimistic at the same time. But remember, a lot of what happens in the future depends on you. So get involved.